and it's really my pleasure to welcome you all. I'm Myra Lombera, Chief Operating Officer at the Michelson 20 Million Minds Foundation, and I'm delighted that everyone is able to join us today for College Education in Prisons, a how-to guide for corrections officials. Before we delve into today's program, I'd just like to take some time to briefly introduce our organization. Founded in 2010 by Dr. Gary K. Michelson and Alia Michelson, the Michelson 20MM Foundation. It's been dedicated to ensuring that everyone, particularly our most vulnerable populations, have access to equitable post-secondary educational opportunities that lead to meaningful careers. We proudly have operated at the cutting edge of higher education to help forward-thinking innovators, nonprofits, and startups close the opportunity gap. And today we are very fortunate to bring together some of the brightest minds and most courageous leaders working to deliver quality higher education programming for some of our most promising and talented individuals behind bars. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gary Michelson, founder and co-chair of the Michelson 20MM Foundation, who will provide opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. The research has consistently shown that high-quality college programs in prison produce a significant return on investment via recidivism reduction. What underlies that are the individual transformations of these prisoners become students. Advancing quality post-secondary educational programming in prisons has been the cornerstone of our Michelson Smart Justice strategy, whose time has now come. Higher education opportunities for incarcerated students have now been expanded under 3 presidential administrations via the successful Second Chance Pell program. We will see an even greater expansion when Pell Restoration is fully implemented in the year 2023. In-prison college does more than transform prisoners into serious students. It offers hope, and it alters the trajectories of these prisoners' lives. Given this critical opportunity, there is much work to be done, especially in promoting cross-sector professional development to advance higher education programming in prison. Today's event will highlight a seminal guide from Dr. Lois M. Davis, a renowned researcher with the RAND Corporation, whose work is often cited in the field because she has been researching public safety and public health for over 30 years. The guide, What Corrections Officials Need to Know to Partner with Colleges to Implement College Programs in Prisons, is a first-of-its-kind publication directed to training corrections officials in addressing the professional development gap in regard to building out a successful in-prison college program. I would also like to recognize the late John Linton and his vital contributions to this project. John dedicated his life to this work, from the beginning of his career in correctional education as a teacher in Maryland prisons, to becoming Maryland's Director of Correctional Education, to serving as Director for the Office of Correctional Education at the U.S. Department of Education. John and Dr. Davis co-authored the guide until his untimely passing in 2019. We extend our deepest gratitude to John and the legacy he has left on the ecosystem for higher education in prison. We extend our condolences to his family and the colleagues who will continue to miss him. What John knew, and what the panelists will illustrate for you today, is that for high quality post-secondary education in prison to continue to take root throughout the country, corrections officials need professional development and training in support of meaningful cross-sector collaboration among colleges and corrections. The guide and this event were crafted with that end goal in mind. Thank you again for joining us. I will now hand things over to Dr. Davis, Senior Policy Researcher at the RAND Corporation, as she highlights the main takeaways from the guide. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Michelson. Before we hand it over to Lois, I'd love to just briefly give an introduction and welcome her. Lois Davis is Senior Policy Researcher at RAND with expertise in correctional education, prisoner reentry, and public safety. She has extensive experience in conducting program evaluations and working with agencies and organizations involved in service provision, policymaking, or the administration of programs. She also previously led the evaluation of the 3 state pathways from prison to post-secondary education demonstration project and the national evaluation funded under the Second Chance Act to assess the effectiveness of correctional education programs for incarcerated adults. So as you can see, you have quite an expert in the field, and we're really delighted that she's able to join us. So welcome, Lois.
Thank you so much. I really greatly appreciate that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with kind of a short briefing that kind of gives the audience a sense of what we were trying to accomplish with this guidebook, and also the key points that we hope you take away. But more importantly, I think what will follow is a robust discussion of experts in the field that we're very delighted to have join us today. So with that, I'm going to ask for the next slide, please. So a little bit of background first. When we think about college programs in prison, most states' departments of corrections require an individual, if they do not have a high school degree or are reading, for example, a 9th grade level, that they earn a GED while incarcerated. But often the rest of the educational programming is not mandatory, and so it's more optional. But one of the things that many people in the field are recognizing is that today, the college education is critical to compete today. If you look at, for example, job postings, 2/3 of them require some level of college education. But also importantly, we're at a time when there's a real resurgence in interest in expanding higher education in prison, and particularly for programs that offer a path to degrees or industry recognized credentials. Next slide, please. So part of that resurgence has been driven by 2 factors. So one is back in 2015, the US Department of Education implemented its Second Chance Pell experimental initiative. And this was the first time since 1994 that Pell grants could be used to help pay for in-prison college programs. At the very beginning, we had grants to colleges in 42 states. Since then has expanded. Sean Addy will talk further about that. But also another key event that has long been awaited was recently the Congress reinstated access to federal Pell grants to all incarcerated individuals. This is expected to further spur expansion in this area. Next slide, please. Nick, thank you. Just briefly, when we think about correctional education programs and the range of rehabilitative programs that are provided, education programs are ones that have a real clear impact on improving employment outcomes as well as reducing recidivism. So RAND did a national study look at this. And what we found was that if an individual participated, for example, in any type of educational program, whether it be adult basic ed, GED prep, career technical education, or vocational training, or college programs, they had a 13 percentage point reduction in their likelihood of recidivating upon release. That's a significant reduction in the risk. In addition, importantly for this discussion today, those who participate in college programs were half as likely to be reincarcerated upon release. We also did a very simple cost effectiveness calculation. And what we're able to show, and this is an underestimate of the cost savings, is that for every dollar spent on these programs, you're basically saving $5 in reincarceration costs. Next slide, please. But in order for these programs to be effective, they must meet the needs of the population. And such questions as, does a college program, for example, fit into the overall Department of Corrections rehabilitative priorities, their educational plan? Who is going to be eligible? Such things as, is there adequate classroom space available? What technology or other resources are needed? What type of commitment of staff and funding is required? Or what are the safety and security requirements? Next slide, please. When John and I first started talking about the idea for guidebook, we actually were having lunch with Steve Stewart in Maryland. And I'd asked John what he thought needed to be done next. And what he said was, corrections officials really need some good guidance on how to think about these programs. And his view was that fundamentally these programs should be a partnership, an equal partnership between colleges and prisons, and a recognition that they're bringing together two very different bureaucracies with different missions, visions, and values to establish these programs. And thus it requires an agreement on overall goals, commitment of resources, and a clear set of expectations. Next slide. But the key he also recognized was that when we look across the landscape of what has been written in this area, a lot of the guidance really is aimed at colleges to help them understand how to establish these programs. And those have been important contributions to the field. However, very little has been written really from the corrections officials' perspectives to really provide them some guidance. And so this particular guidebook we developed was intended to be a starting point for corrections officials who are either considering a new college program or currently have one and thinking about what else needs to be done to ensure its success. We're focusing on academic programs. We're not talking about vocational or career technical education programs. Next slide. Our target audience are really correctional leadership and administrators, wardens and correctional officers, as well as correctional education staff. So in other words, those who have responsibility for overseeing or working closely with colleges in facilitating the establishment and implementation of these college programs. Next slide, please. So this gives you an overview of what the guidebook covers. Depending on the reader, where they're at in terms of their knowledge about these programs or the kind of issues that they're interested in learning more about, this guidebook can give them a sense of what chapters to go to depending on what they require. So we start off with some just basics of what understanding about how college programs in prison are run, who provides them, how are they funded, etc. We then really go through a series of questions about what types of questions should a corrections official ask himself, him or herself, to think about establishing such a program and to get a better understanding of whether or not it makes sense for their particular facility or DOC. We then go through in chapters 4 and 5 the nitty gritty of establishing the basic policies and procedures, as well as what an MOU should require. And one of our panelists will give you a real life example of what that process is like. Next slide, please. So let's start with kind of the basic questions that the guidebook addresses. When you think about who provides these college programs, predominantly it's community college if we look across the state, followed by universities. It's also predominantly by not-for-profit academic institutions. In terms of what types of degrees they offer, for those that offer degree pathways, most of them offer associate degrees followed by bachelor's or bachelor's of arts or sciences, that is a 4-year degree. A few offer other master's degrees. Next slide, please. Pre-COVID, most of these programs were provided primarily through in-person instruction. But since COVID, where we initially had a lockdown of these different of people being able to come into the prison facility to prevent the spread of COVID, we see now emergence more of blended learning programs, that is in-person instruction combined with some reliance on, for example, the use of tablets to augment, and also some online programs. But as our panelists will talk a little bit about this further, there seems to be a strong preference from the college side of returning to in-person instruction, and also for the correctional education side. And that many view these that quality programs fundamentally in this area need to have some element of in-person instruction. Next slide. Now, depending on what state you're in, it's important to recognize that states through legislation, but also policies, may limit what type of degrees, for example, that an incarcerated student can earn. For example, one state, until recently, limited by law that only programs that resulted in a terminal associates of applied science degree could be offered. That was recently changed in 2019. So it's important to understand what your particular state's both laws and policies are in this regard. In addition, I want to just mention statewide articulation transfer credit agreements and why they matter. Ideally, what you'd like to have is that students will complete their college work in prison before release. However, in many cases, just by the nature of being in a correctional setting, it often takes longer than normally to be able to complete that coursework. And so statewide articulation transfer agreements are important because often these individuals may need to continue their education upon release from prison. But what these articulation agreements do is that they help ensure that the credits and credentials that were earned while incarcerated, that they'll be recognized by other post-secondary educations within their state. So that's a key question to ask is whether a college is offering an in-person program or a course that will allow the individual to receive credit and that will be accepted by local colleges and universities. In terms of how the program will be funded, I mentioned that Pell Grants are an important component of spurring the expansion of college programs in the correctional setting. But it's also important to recognize that they only can be used to pay for tuition, fees, books, and supplies required by an individual's education. That means that they do not cover the administrative costs of academic institutions, nor that of departments of corrections to implement and run these programs. So that's an important part of understanding what funding is available. Next slide. In terms of just determining who will be eligible for a program, there's two perspectives on that. So one is that college administrators, of course, will have their own eligibility requirements for a particular course or program. But at the same time, departments of corrections may require, for example, such things that a person be within a certain time frame of their release, that they have a record of clean disciplinary infractions, and they also may bar some individuals, some offenders, for example, sex offenders, are participating in the program. Also want to emphasize the importance of education holds to the success of these programs. One of the challenges for these students is that they may be transferred to another prison facility before they're able to complete their coursework. A transfer to another facility may include going to a facility that no longer has that same college program. So basically disenrolls them for that course. That is why education holds are important for the success of these programs, because they help ensure that these students can remain at their facility in order to complete a college course or complete a certification. Next slide. It's also important to designate correctional staff to serve as point persons, both at the headquarters and facility level for these programs. They will be responsible, for example, for coordinating with the college director on this, as well as doing problem solving. And we can't say enough about the importance of getting staff's buy-in in this area. For example, you may have state leadership such as at the headquarters level, the wardens, assistant wardens, or superintendents who see the value of these programs. But ultimately, you really need to get both correctional officers buy-in as well as that of the correctional education staff and answer their fundamental questions to make sure that they understand why this program is worthwhile and explains their role in making the program work. Next slide, please. So establishing an MOU is the nuts and bolts of that. Our panel member, Carol Saran, will be talking about her experience here in California and doing so, but it's critical because it really establishes the operational framework for the partnership and delineates the respective roles and responsibilities. It establishes such things as duration of the partnership, communication protocols, but also how the program will be funded. And I want to emphasize here that it's important to understand that these programs, it varies from state to state how they are paid for. It includes such things as state funds, such as state corrections appropriations. It may be from college headcount dollars, maybe from state financial aid or inmate self-pay, or also from inmate welfare funds, for example, or philanthropy funds. So it's important that that issue of how the program will be funded will be recognized. And I'm seeing the questions in the chat, and we'll be trying to address those definitely in the panel discussion. Finally, I want to, next slide, please. Clearly then an MOU then that needs to establish administrative oversight of the program to be provided both by the college and the Department of Corrections. Establishing the commitment of staff and resources, and our panelists talk about the commitment of college leadership is key, as well as the commitment of DOC leadership. And then finally also establishing the eligibility requirements that are really going to be a negotiation between the college and the Department of Corrections. Next slide, please. So this is, I want to provide my email address in case people had questions about it. Also, the guidebook is available for free on the RAND website, and we're providing the link here, but I'm also happy to email that to you as required. So with that, I'll turn it back to Myra to introduce the panel.
Thank you so much, Lois. I appreciate everyone's enthusiasm and questions already on the chat. We did share out a link to the guidebook. Please know that we will also be sharing out all the slides that Lois has shared post-event via email. And I see that there's already been some requests for sample MOUs, so I'm sure if we can aggregate some of those, we'll be including those in the post-event email. So thank you again. And it's now my pleasure to welcome today's 4 panelists. Just brief introductions for everyone, as I'm sure you've read their extensive bios and you'll have more of an opportunity to get to hear from them directly. But first off is Sean Addy, who is the Director of Correctional Education in the Department of Education's Office of Correctional Education. He is in the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education. Welcome, Sean. Next, we have Heather Gay, who is the State Assistant Administrator for Prisoner Education. She sits within the Offender Success Administration and began her career in the Michigan Department of Corrections. So welcome, Heather. Todd Butler, who serves as the Dean of Arts, Sciences, and Business Administration at Jackson College in Jackson, Michigan. Pleasure to have you, Todd. And last, but certainly not least, we have Carol Saran, who is the Associate Director of the Lifted Initiative at the University of California, Irvine. For those of you unfamiliar, Lifted is an acronym that stands for Leveraging Inspiring Futures Through Educational Degrees. And it's the first in-prison BA completion program that's offered by the University of California system. So welcome, Carol.
Great, thank you so much. So for the audience participants, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off asking a question for each of the panel members, and then we're going to turn to answering the questions that you all are posing on the Q&A and chat. So we will definitely get to those. But I wanted to just start off with them giving an overview of their perspective on different topics. So I'm going to begin with Sean Addy, and one of the questions that I had for Sean was really to give us an overview about what Pell reauthorization is, why that matters, and what it means for the field. So Sean?
Sure. So first off, I'd like to thank the Michelson Foundation and Lois for sponsoring and putting together this panel. It's an honor to be here and to contribute to what was one of John Winton's passions, really high quality education for people who are in prison. So to provide some background, in December 2020, Congress passed the FAFSA Simplification Act, and one of the provisions included in this act was the reinstatement of federal Pell Grant eligibility for students who are incarcerated in federal and state penal institutions. So this new provision allowed students who were incarcerated to receive Pell Grants. It created a new definition of prison education programs. And it also required the Department of Education to collaborate with the Department of Justice, as well as other stakeholders, to ensure accurate implementation of these new provisions in the Act. When the Act was passed, it stated that the department had until July 1st, 2023 to implement Pell reinstatement. And we announced back in July that we intend to implement these changes to allow eligible students to access Pell Grants beginning on July 1st, 2023. We had the option of implementing earlier, but due to just the work that has to go into implementing this and doing it correctly, we're choosing not to do it until July 1st, 2023. Already the department has taken steps to implement changes to the FAFSA for students who are incarcerated. We've removed the consequences, the consequence questions around selective service registration, as well as requirements around drug conviction. We knew through our second Chance Pell experiment that these had tripped up a lot of students early on in the process who were interested in participating in post-secondary education through our second Chance Pell experiment. We are also exploring ways to help students who have loans in default and figuring out ways to help them reestablish eligibility for federal student aid. That's stuff we're working on just in the interim before July 1st, 2023. We've also announced plans to publish regulations on prison education programs and Pell reauthorization or Pell reinstatement prior to implementation. We held public hearings in June of 2021 as part of the negotiated rulemaking process. And we've also announced that there will be a rulemaking subcommittee on Pell Grant eligibility for prison education programs. This subcommittee is going to be meeting in October and November, and the subcommittee will work with the department to draft and amend the language around prison education programs. And really what this means for the field is that in less than 2 years, incarcerated students will be able to access Pell Grants, pursue post-secondary education, and improve their lives and their family lives and their families' lives and their communities. And it also means that, you know, the reason for this webinar and the guide is that correctional practitioners and educators, if they have not done so already, will need to start thinking about what full implementation looks like.
Thank you so much, Sean. I appreciate it. I'm going to turn next to Heather Gay, who's from the Michigan Department of Corrections. And Heather, as education manager, I wanted you to talk a little bit about your experience in terms of implementing both the Pathways program as well as these programs in general, and what you see as some of the kind of key lessons learned or things that corrections officials may need to consider as they're also thinking about implementing these programs.
Great, thank you, Lois, and thank you, Michelson Foundation, for having me. Any tribute to John Litton, I'm very excited and honored to be part of, a mentor, a leader for sure. Going back to the days of the state educational directors, and he was one of the first men I met, and just a quiet, great leader. So I wanted to say that. I'd like to first start by talking about correctional leadership. One of the main things that worked for us in Michigan is we early on identified a stakeholder, a champion, someone who worked for corrections, but could be the liaison between our post-secondary partners. Leadership has got to give this person, this champion, the knowledge, the support, so that they can learn what's happening nationally around Pell restoration, and also what's happened locally with their college partners and what they need to do. Another point of reference that I would make is collect data. Find out what your incarcerated population needs. What communities are they paroling to? What higher ed needs are there out there for your population? So then when you start to engage with partners and post-secondary folks, you can have those very candid conversations about what the data is telling us. What diverse offerings do we need to make sure our population is paroling with? Because ultimately our population wants to be employed. They want to have higher education degrees so that they can get better paying jobs to support their families post-release. One other point I would make too is communication. One thing we learned, and Dr. Butler will talk about this with our Pathways program, was communication was key. We had regular conversations. We talk everything out. I encourage you to do it in person or through COVID now, we're doing it on Teams. Email sometimes you don't get the trust, you don't get that connections to your higher ed folks doing things on email or the telephone. So I would encourage you as you start out right from the gate to ensure you're having these candid conversations and making sure you're expressing what corrections needs are as well. Your higher ed partners will listen and they will help you brainstorm ways to solutions to solve the problems. Another point that I'd like to share that we learned through Pathways also is make sure you're engaging your corrections folks that are working in the housing units, that are working at the facilities, that are working in the gates at the front desk. Make sure you're having conversations as a corrections official when we go in to tour and we go in to figure out where we're going to put our post-secondary programs. We're talking to those folks right from the beginning. They have such great insight, and they can really make your program successful. And put in and make sure you set up that line of communication where, hey, if you have a problem, shoot me an email, call me, let me know. We will solve it. We will get it fixed. So that's one thing that I would end on, Lois, is making sure that the communication both with your higher ed partners as well as the line staff and corrections is very, very valuable.
Thank you so much, Heather. I really strongly agree with that statement. To provide the college perspective is Todd Butler. Todd is Dean of Jackson College. And Todd, from the college perspective, what are some of the lessons learned that you have seen in partnering with Heather and her team in implementing programs?
Thank you, Lois. And thank you to the Michelson Foundation for bringing and hosting this really important conversation today. I'm going to ask for three things to think about. One is patience. When Heather talks about direct communication, staying in contact, please, on the corrections side, stay patient with your educational partners. Our world could not be more different than the world you live in every day. And we are not trying to be obstinate. We're not trying to be obtuse. We literally live in different worlds. And sometimes the things you're asking or the things you're requiring of us, that's not how we operate. And it's just important to know that our intent is good. And if you stay patient with us and you help us through the practices, which is what I want to talk about next, we will get there together. It takes a lot of trust building, it takes a lot of time together. And sometimes it just takes you repeating yourself a number of times before we understand it. Heather and I have been partners in this for 8 years. And I say often about corrections, you know how when you were getting older, the older you got, the smarter your parents became? That's how I feel about corrections. That the longer I'm in this business, didn't take us 8 years, but the longer I'm in this business, the more we understood why you were asking us to do things. We saw what can go wrong. We saw how well it can go when we follow the things you're asking of us. And I know corrections has grown and learned on their own about what higher ed is about. So be patient with each other. The second thing is to form some really good practices. When we first started this process, we were just a square peg in a round hole. We didn't quite fit anything, and we were put through the volunteer orientations at the facilities. And those were meant for maybe somebody who comes in once a month for a half hour or an hour religious service or something like that. And we have faculty that are going in, 3 or 4 times a week, maybe hours at a time. Our staff are going in constantly. And we weren't getting quite the training we needed. We were running into problems. We were creating some of our own problems, but we didn't know what that meant. And someone in the corrections office, not Heather, had decided that we would be bumped to a different category. And they took a new group of faculty members to be trained and put them through a 2-day seminar where they literally had to act out hostage situations and were asked to grab somebody by the arm and flip them over their head and throw them onto the ground. At the end of that day, I had faculty members quit. They just called me and quit and said, this is not what I signed up for. And I'm on the phone with Heather. How did we get here? What happened? And it was just terribly confusing. Finally, we got to the point where we were working with each other on not what the rules are, but why are there rules? Why does this thing exist? What can happen? And once we started going behind the scenes and really educating educators, right? So don't just list a whole bunch of rules for the educational institutions. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. It's saying, here's what we're trying to protect you from. Here's what we're trying to protect the program from, right? Because if things go wildly wrong, the program is in danger, and certainly human lives are in danger. And here's what we're trying to protect, and here's how to do that. So when you get those practices lined up and you're able to communicate with each other, we just completed a training a couple of weeks ago virtually for probably 70 or 80 people, just really high caliber stuff. And it was done as partners, not done as here's what I'm mandating of all of you, and you just do it. It was a real conversation, and educators could ask questions, be engaged, and come out better. The final thing is, I just absolutely know you're going to start seeing performance changes in your incarcerated population. And housing units was really big for us. Once we started doing housing units, you get a critical mass of people making a positive impact at a facility. But also that individual levels, watching people who were scared to death and acting out in their first couple of classes really go on to change and become leaders and become repatriated citizens, not just as changed peoples, but people who are going to go back to their communities. They were going to go back to their families and be leaders of change there. So Lois has documentation on ticket levels and behavioral incidences and things like that that go down as prison education increases. But please believe us when we educators say we believe in the power of education to be transformative. That's what we believe. That's why we do what we do. And please allow us to bring our gifts to your mission and to your work that you're doing inside the facilities.
Thank you so much, Todd. I really strongly agree with that. I wanted to now, I should say that you're also having on this panel member a lot of old timers here, because we were talking about how the four of us really came to know each other many years ago when we first started working on the Pathways program in Michigan. So it's nice to hear everybody's perspective now. I wanted to turn next to Carol, and then we'll open it up to the questions. I've been monitoring kind of what you've been putting in the Q&A and chat. Carol's experience here in California is important because it's recent, and it's really the nuts and bolts of how do you both develop those relationships with the Department of Corrections, negotiate, establishing a new program, and thinking about establishing an MOU. So with that, I'd like for Carol to kind of talk to us about her experience.
Thank you very much, Lois. And I think I'm sort of the newbie on the block here, but let me first thank the Michelson Foundation, both for inviting us to speak. I'm representing a group of us, and also for the seed money that they provided to get our project off the ground. I'm speaking to you kind of from the ground up. I'm a faculty member here at the University of California, Irvine. And so the question I'm going to address is, how did a working group of faculty move from a commitment to extend access to incarcerated students to earn a BA from the University of California to implementation? So I'm kind of coming at it from a slightly different framework, I think. Anyway, so there are three foundational pieces that we inherited that are key for the success, I think, of our program. The first is the California Master Plan for Higher Education, and it's three tiers: the University of California, the state colleges, and the open access to community colleges. So the community colleges in California are all over the state. There are about 135 of them, and they offer both vocational and academic degrees that allow students to transfer from a community college to either the UC or the CSU. The students to transfer to the UC need to have a 3.4 GPA, so the bar is pretty high, but it also includes a series, to go back to what Lois said, a series of articulation agreements about the courses that are required and so forth. So there's a very well articulated process in California to move between an open access, second chance community college for all citizens in the state to either the CSU or the UC. The second foundation is that in 2014, the governor signed legislation that allocated resources to community colleges to teach face-to-face courses in prison and receive the same reimbursement as they did for courses taught on campuses. And it kind of rolled out. And then in about 2016, the chancellor of the community colleges intervened to incentivize the community colleges to focus on transferable degrees. And to that end, he focused on an AA degree is what we call it, that's transferable to UC or CSU in sociology, psychology, or communications. So those three pieces were in place when my colleagues and I began to think about how to move forward to go from an AA degree to a BA degree. And our goal here is, and I guess this is the sociologist in me, a degree translates into concrete human capital, and it mitigates the stigma of a criminal record. As one of the students has commented, no one can take your degree away from you. And when you meet for incarcerated or formerly incarcerated students, that is kind of a linchpin of why this is such a powerful experience. So with that, our first step, of course, was to identify a community college to partner with and a prison. And we identified a community college that's relatively close to us, Southwestern College in San Diego, that has a very strong commitment to social justice programs, excellent leadership in this area, and has established a firm foundation with the prison in the area, RJD, the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility. One of the key building blocks of our program, of our project, which has kind of guided us from the beginning, is that all students, whether a student is at RJD or at the University of California Irvine campus, they must meet the same standards, the same academic standards. In other words, we would not take a student with a 3.2, unfortunately, or we're not making any exceptions. We're simply building on the master plan vision established in the 1960s and extending it to a new site. And if there are questions about why we're so key on that, we can come back in the Q&A. We've envisioned this as a 3-year demonstration project to test its viability. And then our goal moving forward is twofold. One is to roll out additional majors, and the other is to demonstrate that it's scalable across the entire University of California to build what we call these triangles between a community college, a prison, and a UC campus. So I want to talk a little bit about what we did to build support on campus, even before we went to the CDCR, the California Department of Corrections. We presented our ideas to the deans at their monthly meetings. We then followed up with those deans and asked them to make a commitment that they would contribute 2 course releases towards the launch of the program. We then met with all the senior administrators below the chancellor, not including the chancellor, the executive vice chancellor, the dean of undergraduate studies, the vice chancellor for equity and inclusion, the vice chancellor for enrollment management, the academic senate, the registrar. In other words, we got all our ducks in a row about what this program, how it would work. We got support from these various groups. And then we did a lot of outreach to faculty to form an advisory committee. So all of that was designed to build support on our campus. And then we went to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. The first person I met was Brant Choate, and I know Shannon's here Shannon and I followed Heather's advice and got to know each other even in the midst of the pandemic. We actually had lunch in my backyard once when when Shannon was down here. So we reached out to the California Department of Corrections. And I'm kind of proud to say that every question that Brant or Shannon kind of threw at us, did you do this? Did you do that? We could say yes. We had really done the homework on our side of the fence that we needed to do before we even approached them. And what both Shannon and Brant shared with us is that they would not go forward with any kind of an agreement without support, clear articulation of support from the senior officer on our campus. And our campus happens to be a chancellor. So that meant we had to go and work with our chancellor to secure his support. And so we did that, and we were then ready. We mapped out the MOU. In California, the memo of understanding is kind of a loose document. Someone asked to have it shared. I'm happy to send it to Rachel, and we can send it on, share it at a later point. The memo of understanding is a memo of understanding. So the first step in this process is that we're agreeing to work together. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Of course, in the midst of all of this, COVID hit and everything went on hold. And the most important impact that it's had is we were supposed to launch in the fall of 2021, and we probably won't launch until the fall of 2022. But we continued to work. We didn't really let COVID get in our way. And we wanted to make the MOU signing as splashy as we could, without, even though it was going to be in a virtual environment like we are right now. So we secured the support of our Chancellor, Howard Gilman, and the Secretary of Corrections and the CDCR to appear in a virtual signing. We secured the support of the President of the University of California, Michael Drake, who sent notes of congratulations. And thanks to the Michelson Foundation, we had a wonderful video sent by Senator Cory Booker, who's been in the trenches on prison education for years. And then our press office here and the press office in the CDCR sent it out to staffers in the state legislature, the LA Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, newspapers, potential donors, point I'll come back to in a minute. And we had it was a very moving moment. We had two formerly incarcerated students who are now PhD students here speak. And I sent the video, we can circulate the video. We have a short 5-minute clip of the highlights. And it did get a fair amount of attention. So it had the effect that we were hoping. We wanted it to create a buzz. And so now moving forward, we are moving from the MOU, which is sort of this vision statement, though it's all in legal language, and don't get me wrong, to the contract. And the contract is more the nitty gritty. I can't share, I'll be happy to share it when it's signed. It's not at that point yet. But the contract really spells out the obligations of the University of California and the obligations of the CDCR to provide classrooms, space, technology, which is kind of a sticking point for a lot of reasons. Not that we don't want to see it happen, but it's just slow. And the monetary arrangements. So Lois touched upon this, but I want to raise the issue of fundraising. I mean, that's a huge piece. I'm actually retired professor, so I have the time to write. So I spend a lot of my time writing grant applications. We just sent one off yesterday. The University of California is very lucky because we have a program called Blue and Gold, which it allows for students whose families earn less than $80,000 in their California residence. Their tuition is waived. RJD and Southwestern were Pell grants. Thank you, Sean. And we have support from our executive vice chancellor. We estimate that we need about $350,000 a year to launch this demonstration project, with the goal of eventually convincing the state legislature that, for the reasons Lois pointed out in the beginning, this just makes a lot of sense financially to do. This is a lot less expensive than a year in prison. So our vice chancellor has committed half the budget per year for the 3 years of the demonstration project. And we're fundraising largely from Orange County Family Foundations have been our biggest source of support. And we're grateful to the people in our Office of Development who have identified those family foundations that are particularly interested in the kind of work that we're trying to do. We're also working out the concrete program of courses that we'll be offering, keeping faculty informed of these, where we stand, and we're beginning to also work with transfer students on the process of preparing their applications for the University of California. So we're also working, kind of mentoring them on that transition process. I've gone on probably too long, but I just want to wrap up by saying that while COVID posed an enormous challenge, when working with prisons, as Todd pointed out, there's going to be ups and downs. We speak very different languages. There are going to be setbacks and successes and failures and challenges, but the goal is to keep your eye on the prize. And there are people like Shannon Swain and Brant Choate who get it inside California, the prison systems across the country. So I guess I'll just close by saying that I've worked on many projects over the course of my career. I've been at this for a long, long time, but this has been the most gratifying by far. Thank you for your time.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Carol. It's Carol referred to both state legislation as well as the Blue Gold program. In other words, California is pretty rich in terms of how it has resources in place to support these programs. Unfortunately, that's not going to be the case in many states. California is a really good case study to understand what other states might be able to do, but I think it's important for everybody to recognize that funding issue is a big issue, and it has to really be considered and thought of in the context of what's happening within your particular state. With that said, I wanted to, you touched about COVID, and I wanted to just open it up to the panel members to talk a little bit about what is COVID, how has that impacted, for example, in Michigan, your programs, both from Heather's perspective and Todd's perspective, and how might it change moving forward, how we think about providing these programs within correctional settings?
Thank you, Lois. I'd like to talk about COVID. COVID has impacted our entire nation. We were shut down as a state for our educational programs for quite a long time. Our director, extremely supportive. One of the first programs we started to bring back were our college partners. As soon as we started to see a little reprieve, engaging our college partners right away. I think it's really important also for those correctional leaders out there that are going to begin to build under this COVID model to really understand when you're creating educational opportunities for incarcerated folks, it really has to mirror to the best of our ability what the educational experience would look like in the world, as we say in the world. So I think that that's really important. One thing that COVID did was lit a fire for us around technology. What were we going to do to engage our college partners, and also for educational, whether you're working on GED classes, whether you're working on vocational classrooms, what does technology look like when you can't have in person 20 students in a classroom, 6 hours a day anymore? We just can't do that. So one of the things that we're looking at in Michigan is a learning management system. We're piloting one now. We'd like to roll it out to our academic classes, our GED classes, bring in some vocational, although vocational needs to be hands-on, but most definitely at the table will be our college partners to be able to deliver content, to be able to do, if they still come in 1 day a week, they're still able to meet with students 3 days a week. So that's the hybrid approach that Todd and I have talked about and that we're working on in Michigan. Corrections is going to have to start moving into the technology era. It's time.
Thank you. Todd?
Yeah, I'll stay out of the technical things that we were trying to nuance our way through. I think the most important thing for us is that COVID took a lot of noise out of the room. And all of a sudden, we understood how important education was and how important this partnership was with our corrections side. I mean, this was, if any of you in corrections, you know, this was really scary time. This was a horrific time to be an incarcerated person or to be working in a facility like that. And then the loss of family visits, the loss of educational programming, other types of programming, religious programming. And it became really important that we figure out a way together how to continue to deliver education, because the men and women who were students there needed it. They needed something positive to focus on. They needed to be able to move forward. And I felt like, as good as our relationship has been, it grew by leaps and bounds during COVID. We started meeting every other week. We have a standing meeting, about an hour. And before, we used to meet when there were problems, or we would connect with each other from time to time, or do our couple times a semester trainings. Now we're meeting a lot. And we did take leaps forward in terms of some technological advances, some things we were able to do together that we had not been allowed to do before. And, they say necessity is the mother of invention. And we together were able to invent some ways to move forward. But I really think it was this clarity of objective of education and the trust and partnership and working together that really rose during COVID. This is our first week back inside this week, getting things ready, and our classes start next week. So this is the first time in more than 18 months that we've been able to go back into a facility.
I wanted to just say that we're very fortunate to have on this call some real experts out in the virtual world too. So I note that Brant Choate from CDCR just put in the chat that California has adopted the same learning management system as all of our colleges. That seems like a critical advance that we're seeing in the field. And so I encourage you guys also to be reading some of the chat, because we have some real experts and they're also providing input. I wanted to ask Sean Addy about, I know the Department of Education has been thinking a lot about the role of technology in correctional education. And I was wondering if you had any thing you wanted to say there about the work that you guys are doing.
Sure. So we actually put out a publication of the department in 2015, looking at the use of technology in correctional education. And we're actually in the process right now of, I was going to say updating, but it's really reimagining or taking a fresh look at what state systems are doing around correctional education. We're hoping to have that out this year. Fingers crossed on that. But I think the big thing that we're looking at for technology is really using it, as Heather said, to, thank you, Michelle, for dropping that in the chat, is really using technology to buttress in-person education. People who are taking classes inside of facilities are going to be coming back out. And then when they come back out, they're going to be using technology. So getting them used to it. And seeing it as just an additional tool in their toolbox, knowing how technology works, looking at wired internet, wireless internet, whitelisted sites, and having those tools and that access inside of correctional facilities, because technology is not going away. And I think COVID has just, I don't know if I'd want to say exacerbated, but it's really just shown how important technology is when it comes to delivering high quality education. And I think that piece is crucial when we talk about technology for correctional education, is the high quality aspect of it. I think it's either Heather or Todd who said, we want the same kind of quality that someone's getting on the outside that they're getting on the inside. And I think that applies with technology as well.
Thank you. And then one of the questions poses is, and I'm going to open it up to whoever might have some insights about this, is, are there funding sources that are favorable to helping corrections upgrade their facility-based technology? Is that, I don't know what Michigan's experience is, or if you all know of any options for corrections. So.
We not there's a lot of grants out there. I know Department of Justice have put a lot of grants out there to write for that are technology based, reentry based, and I'm sure we'll be following the post secondary too around technology. But nothing really. We have an intranet already in Michigan, so we're building off that platform that we already have in existence.
Thank you. Another question has to do with concerns brought up by higher education partners about how Second Chance Pell may affect a student's eligibility to receive Pell funds post-relief if they choose to continue their college education out in the community. Sean, do you have any response to that or input?
Sure. I mean, it's an interesting question because, traditionally, someone can have 6 years of Pell Grant eligibility. There's a complicated formula I can drop in the chat for folks that they want to know more about how Pell eligibility is calculated. And it's a question of, is someone better situated while they're incarcerated to access their Pell funding and use it? Again, there are limitations on what it can be used for versus someone returning home and access and using their Pell Grant funds at that point. And I think there are pluses and minuses. And I think that's something that corrections and institutions of higher education should be having discussions, informing people who are enrolling. I mean, I'm sure they're doing it already, but being very thoughtful when it comes to explaining to people that, if they use their Pell eligibility, they may not have access to it when they come home. And as it was mentioned, people can only use it for sort of those 4 categories while they're incarcerated. Whereas if you are out in the community, you could potentially, help you with transportation or housing or some of the other issues that arise. I think it really does cut both ways because, while someone's incarcerated, there are concerns. There are different types of concerns when they're in the community. Housing may not necessarily be the same type of concern when someone's incarcerated, so they may be able to focus on education. So I think it's something that educational institutions and correctional institutions have to be very thoughtful about when it comes to it's really financial aid counseling for people who are participating in programs.
And Lois, if I could add to that, I'd refer you to the work of Davis Jenkins and the Community College Research Center. One of the greatest worries about Pell and the ways that students lose it is either by 2 things: by not making satisfactory academic progress, they're not passing classes and making progress, or what we call on the outside swirl, which means they start down this program and they take a bunch of classes, and then those classes don't count for anything when they switch over here and take a bunch of classes. And the Guided Pathways Initiative on the outside has been clarifying that for the last several years at community colleges across the country. But in the prisons, we don't have that problem. We're much more efficient. We never run into that swirl problem because we're offering courses and we're guiding students in very hands-on ways, both within corrections and the higher ed, to say, here's the class you're taking next, how this counts to your degree, and they don't lose that eligibility. And as far as making satisfactory academic progress, these are just stellar students. Their academic standards and accomplishments are incredible. We very, very, very rarely run into somebody who would have difficulty making satisfactory academic progress.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Todd, can you put in the chat the reference to that guidebook? I'd like to look at it that you mentioned. That sounds very helpful. There's also the question is if the panelists would be willing to share their email address so that individuals can reach out with specific questions. If you're fine with that, that would be really helpful. Thank you. We touched upon it, but I want to kind of get each of you to comment on, because it's a concern and debate that's going on right now, and that is, what do we consider to be high quality education within a correctional setting? And and what are the concerns about how technology can either support that or maybe may lead to some concerns about maintaining that quality. So Carol, do you want to start off with that?
Sure. One of the things, so, I guess we are very concerned about the quality of the education. We're very committed here to replicating essentially the University of California education inside a prison. One of the things as a faculty member that I'm excited about with the addition of, with the opening up of technology is that we can have students who are in residence at UCI in classes with students in residence at our prison, RJD. And the pedagogical and learning opportunities that opens up for all the students is just, whether the course is on the Holocaust or on, the sociology of punishment, whatever the topic is, it just creates an enormous opportunity for learning and communicating among students in completely different ways. And I guess the concern I have with the impact of COVID over the last year, not just on students who are incarcerated, but students who are on campuses as well, is asynchronous learning classes. And so when I think about this, I really only think about it as synchronous, and that is that students are either in a virtual space like we are right now, or in a face-to-face context with the professor, not this recording. That would be my biggest concern. I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Yeah, definitely.
I'll just add one other thing. We envision that the partnership with RJD and Southwestern will also open up the opportunity for performances. We have a School of the Arts here that it gives students in the arts and drama the opportunity to perform at a new venue, which is what they're trying to do. We see it as an opportunity for the speakers that we have on campus to use technologies like this so that students on site can enjoy what it means to be at a big research university. And technology definitely facilitates all that.
Thank you. That's anyone else want to speak to the question of how do we define what's quality education and the role of technology in that?
I'd jump in there, Lois, on this one. One thing that has to happen when you're talking about high quality is it has to start with the student. I was happy to hear the panelists earlier talk about these pathways and Todd's comment on that. Shout out to Vera and Brian Walsh really quick. I'm gonna use something I learned in my leadership academy, is that with those pathways, you oftentimes have to start from the end and work your way back. What does that individual want his career to look like post-release? Start there, look at his county of parole, work your way back on his pathway or her pathway, and what does it start with, and how can we put resources and guidance and all of those programming and educational opportunities in between. I think that is really what's important to high quality. It has to be personal, it has to be within their individual interests and aptitude. It has to start there. We mentioned it earlier, and Jackson College-wide, I really love them as our partners. They always do this. I don't even have to say it. We always have to mirror, they always mirror for us what that classroom looks like on their college campus in my prisons. That to me, it just speaks volumes. That's why the in-person piece is so very, very important. Yes, technology has a place. Absolutely. Technology is going to help them be successful post-release as well. So we have to include technology, but that in-person experiences, what they learn from those college instructors is very, very valuable, and it's going to help them be successful post-release. So that is one thing I would say. College folks that are on this call that are listening, one thing I would challenge you to do is look at diverse degree offerings. We've got to get more diverse in our degrees, and corrections is on that. I'm challenging corrections too, because we have to allow those programs to come in. But what I will keep saying is, find out the population in which you're going to serve, their interest and aptitude, get more degree offerings that are diverse. So they will be successful. They will stick with it. It will lead to a career. And then corrections, we need to be a little more open to more diverse offerings. So that would be my definition of high quality.
Thank you so much. Todd?
Yes, all of us agree that we would be completely negligent is the best word I can come up with if we're not doing high quality technical training in the prisons as related to education, not just technical classes, but thinking about how do we teach students to research, to do quality research, and to navigate something that probably wasn't in existence called the web when many of them went away or they weren't doing that. And then how to access that for all sorts and leverage that for all sorts of things that they're going to do. But we really believe that it needs to start with becoming a community of scholars. And our first class that we throw out there is the first year seminar. And it is built around what is called the on-course principles, Dr. Skip Downing. And it is focused entirely upon self-responsibility, being a leader, being a creator, not a victim, taking charge of your education, and then thinking about, as Heather just said, what's the end? What's the end goal? And what do I need to do there? But in that classroom, we teach that whole thing is designed so that they can have practice and have the experience of becoming a community of scholars, so that they can walk forward in a different way in their future classes. And that's it doesn't matter if that's our on-campus students or not, that's a very difficult class to pull off when it's fully online. When you start face-to-face, you're seeing each other, you're modeling behaviors about how to be in the classroom, how to disagree in the classroom, how to share ideas, how to back up my thinking. All of those things are precipitated or made much easier when you're working face-to-face, building that community, building that trust, and modeling how to do that in an academic setting.
Lois, can I just jump in here for 1 sec? I want to just, I guess, raise another point, and that is, and having taught many thousands of students over many, many years, students often don't know what they're interested in because they haven't had the opportunity to explore new ideas. And so while it's good to have a goal, often the goal, all of our goals, if you think back on your own goals when you started college, can be somewhat parochial because we didn't know very much. And part of the joy of a liberal arts education is to learn about things that you didn't even know existed. And so I think it's really important to start out perhaps with a goal, but also to allow a student to understand that it's fine to change that goal. From teaching here at UCI, we have many first-generation students who have a lot of pressure from their families to major in certain things because it's practical or whatever. And these students face, when they get out, they need to kind of hit the ground running. But there also has to be space to just explore the life of the mind and let it take you where you never imagined going. So it's kind of a delicate walk if we're really going to think about what the opportunity of a meaningful liberal arts education is all about.
Thank you. That's a really good point. And one of the comments in the chat was related to that in many states, unfortunately, particularly rural states, you may have facilities that are not near universities or community colleges. And so it brings that tension between how do you provide educational opportunities in those settings and the role of, for example, online education versus in-person instruction. And I know that, I don't know, Todd, if you had anything to say about that, but I remember from Pathways that really some of these instructors had to drive long distances to go to the prison facilities to be able to provide instruction. Do you have any comments about that, any of the panel members?
Well, I mean, that's a challenge we're facing Richard J. Donovan is 75 miles. So one of the things that we're just really nitty gritty hoping to do is that classes will be in 3-hour segments and 2 faculty will go down. So it's once a week rather than what would be on campus twice a week. So, I mean, the prison is not nearby for us. And, you know, and also we plan to reimburse faculty for cost of transportation, given the distance. So those are 2 very nitty gritty things that we're thinking about that we plan to do, given the distance of the prison.
Todd?
Yeah, if you're familiar with the geography of Michigan, we were operating in the UP in Marquette Branch Prison. We were both blessed by that the University of Northern Michigan is in that same city, and we could draw on a group of faculty from there. But it was enormously challenging. You know, that's 8 to 10 hours away from us, and we're trying to manage that. Have to hire somebody on site to manage that and to try to watch the quality. And I think it was a very good program, but it takes a lot of work, a lot of challenge. Right now, our furthest prison is about 125 miles away. And it is, again, a challenge to get up there, and you're sort of, it gets expensive to reimburse faculty. Faculty get tired of driving that far, usually in an evening and driving back. And you look for somebody local, and then you begin to lose control. They're not part of the culture of the campus, our campus. They're not necessarily understanding the outcomes that we're seeking on our campus, and that we want, as Heather mentioned, we want to mirror those same outcomes in the prison. So we have to do a lot of extra work and a lot of monitoring. I have to do a lot of traveling. I have to drop in an evening to a prison 125 miles away, unexpected, sit down, see what the quality of education is. You cannot pretend as educators that if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, and it must be working well because I haven't heard about any problems. It takes a lot of legwork on corrections. It takes a lot of legwork on the college end to keep the high quality programs when you're working at a distance from the campus.
Thank you. That's one of the questions that was posed was by Steve Stewart, who is well known to all of us and is one of the leaders in this field, is that we can't forget about those inmates who currently don't qualify for post-secondary education. As we know that that's clearly a concern in many, for all state prison systems. I just wanted to mention that that I always was struck by John Linton's really laying it out and advocating that we need to think about developing the continuum of educational opportunities within each of these systems. That doesn't stop at the GED, but really thinks about it being as a building blocks for the next step in the educational process, and build that into the educational plans and thinking about education that way rather than being binary. I saw, Sean, you were nodding there. Does anybody have anything to add to that or comments?
I would just add that I think, as we're talking about, sort of full implementation of Pell in 2023, sort of now is the time for corrections officials, policymakers, so people who are in this space to really think about gearing up their adult education and CTE programs and sort of creating those pathways for students. I know a while ago now in Michigan, Todd and folks at Jackson were doing work around developmental education, and they were working on, I forget the term, I know Todd, maybe you remember it, but it was basically blended classes to get people sort of up to speed for math. I know they have done a lot of work in that space. So it's really sort of thinking holistically about, this opportunity is going to exist. It's going to be here very soon. And also, it's also a useful motivation for someone who may not be pursuing their high school equivalency, is that, there is something more beyond this.
Great, thank you. Todd?
Yeah, thank you, Sean. They're called co-requisite courses, where you take a developmental course and you blend it with the college level course at the same time, same moment. You're simultaneously enrolled. And our goal was to end standalone developmental education, where students would have to take a series of developmental education courses before they could get to college classes. And one of the keys of that was we were emboldened by our work in the prisons and what those students were able to do when we gave them full reign. And it allowed us to be more courageous in our moves on campus at getting rid of standalone education. It's been a long process. It's probably been the single best initiative we have ever done on our campus. And it was made possible by the work that we experimented in the prisons with, and the inmates knocked it out of the park. The incarcerated students just overachieved and told us this could work on campus, and it has.
Thank you. Thank you. I also wanted to mention that all of us have been very fortunate to have known and worked with John Linton and learned from him. We're fortunate today that his wife Linda is listening to this webinar, as well as with her good friend David, who has also worked closely with John over the years. So I'm hoping that Linda, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I am hoping that this discussion is really helping you to understand how important John played a role in all of our work and personally. So, so before we wind up, I wanted to just ask each of the panelists, is there one thing that you feel that it's important for corrections officials to take away from this webinar that you'd like them to consider as they start moving forward with this this area? So who would like to jump in on that?
I can, I'll take.
Yes.
I guess if I had one message, especially with the return of the Pell program, which is so fantastic, I would urge leaders in education in departments of corrections to really look to vet the programs that they allow in very carefully. And I would urge them to not go down the path of for-profit universities. So I'll leave it at that.
Todd? Or Heather, sorry.
Oh, you want me to go? Okay. One thing that I saw a lot of action over here in the chat, and I was reading, Aaron had a really good point in the chat. He's also from Michigan. Shout out to Aaron. I think corrections leadership really needs to be challenged in the whole ideology. For example, everything we do has a very good reason of why we do it. One thing that I've struggled with when Todd and I and Sean and Lois too started our journey in 2013, you know, I built up what I thought in my mind. I thought a perfect student to be successful would look like. Boy, has that changed over the last 7 years. But one of the things that I looked at was, you know, we didn't want students to have misconducts for 2 years. We wanted their incarceration to be a certain time limit. And really, I was wrong. You know, I mean, you look at, and when you really start to dig into the individual students and the data, and you put it all together in one picture, it's really deeper than just looking at the amount of tickets one gets or their sentence or what they're in prison for. That's irrelevant. The thing that I would challenge leaders in corrections to look at is the whole theory on what comes first, the chicken or the egg. So if I exclude all of these students because they have too many, I'll use misconducts, they have too many misconducts, right? What if I would have included those students and then their behavior improves? Because that's what education does, right? So that's what I would challenge educational leaderships to look at, is let's not put boxes, let's not put definitions, let's look at the whole picture of an individual to set them up for success. That's what I'd say, Lois.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Anybody else? Todd?
Yeah, I'll just share our experience. When we first started our prison education program, there was no Pell, there was no Pathways from Prison program, many grants. We could only work with students who had the ability, either themselves or their families, to pay for education. And the students were incredibly high achieving. And when Pathways from Prison came on, when I first met Sean and Lois, there was this sense that now that we're going to open it up, the quality will go down. Students don't have skin in the game. Their families aren't. These are different quality of students. And Heather and I kept wondering, what's this going to be like? And it started off bumpy. It really did, didn't it, Heather? I mean, it started off bumpy. And the quality of students never dropped, never dropped. And then when Second Chance Pell started and expanded, we heard the exact same mantra again. People said the quality of students is going to go down. Now we're not handpicking, we're not getting the students who don't have violations and tickets, etc. And we're opening it up, and the quality never dropped. It still blows us away about what they're able to accomplish under the conditions that they work in and study in. And as we move further and further into this, our students have never changed. The quality has remained high. Our challenge on corrections and especially on the education side is to match that quality, to keep that quality high, and to do our part in that bargain. And Lois, if you just permit me just one second, John. I was sitting in my office a number of years ago, and I got a call on a Friday afternoon from New York. See, the person saying they were from New York City's mayor's office and asking us how we were doing such and such thing. And I explained it. And the very last question they said was, where's your authority? How are you doing that? And I went into this full-blown panic because I tore apart my entire office trying to find the document that we had based all this work on. And I thought, my God, I am going to be running the prison education program from inside the prison. And it was late on a Friday afternoon, and I picked up the phone and called John Glidden and said, John, help me out. Literally in 30 seconds, he had the answer in front of me, because that's just who John was. He was the foremost expert in the country on what we were doing, and yet he was incredibly accessible to all of us all the time. And I just want to say, Linda, thank you for sharing him. Thank you for sharing him with us.
Thank you. That's really important to hear. Sean?
Yeah, I think I would just sort of add what everyone else is saying. And what's great, Carol, about your point is actually for Pell Restoration, nonprofit or for-profit institutions are not allowed to participate. So that's not an issue. But I think I would say what we're seeing here, how important partnerships and communication and relationships are to successful programs. And I think also it's about not reinventing the wheel and learning from other people who are already doing this, and instead of trying to do it all yourself, to go your own way. I think we had at one point over 100 people on here. There's a community out there of practitioners who are accessible and who are available. And I think kind of the final thing I would say is just how important language is. Education changes people's lives. And I think it's also important, when we're talking about, people in prison and people in college and prison programs, that they're students, and that's part of removing that stigma, is using, positive language or trying to improve their lives and be commended for it.
That's a really, really good point. I strongly agree with that. You guys have been wonderful. I wanted to thank you all for taking the time to participate, both the panel members, but also the participants. I hope you all got something useful out of this. And I myself have learned a lot from listening to you guys. Plus, it's just really nice to connect with old friends again. So thank you. I'm going to turn it back now to Myra at the Michelson Foundation.
Thank you, Lois. Thank you so much. I want to just start off by thanking our co-host, Rand Corporation. You, Lois, in particular, have been a long-term partner for us in this work. The Michelson 20mm Foundation started this work back in 2017 when we launched our Smart Justice Initiative. And I remember the very first event we actually hosted at Rand Corporation here in Santa Monica. And we did a screening, an optional screening of 13th with Ava DuVernay, who produced that. And it's just been an incredible experience to see the passion behind a lot of this work and the commitment that you've all really put into this. It's a multi-year, I think, giving to really be able to advance this work. And as you all mentioned, it requires a ton of patience to work in partnership and the seeding of trust to be able to work through the range of challenges that will inevitably arise as you're trying to work through those agreements and establish protocol and procedures for being able to really establish these prison programs. There's going to be ongoing issues when it comes to cost, when it comes to the implementation of technology, which yes, inevitably we need to do that. When these students are released back into community, they're going to have to work with tech. That's where the world is headed. And so we want to make sure that we're adequately preparing them. I also want to thank our panelists for the very rich conversation that was grounded, not just in your unique experiences, but what will inevitably be the experiences of anyone else who is joining us in this work. It's apparent that it's going to require a ton of creativity and willingness from corrections and higher education leaders, because only leaders are stepping into this space to be willing to work through all of the challenges as they arise. And lastly, thank you to our audience for giving your time so generously to learn more. We hope that today's discussion will inspire you to join in the work for advancing higher education and prison programming. And of course, today would not have been possible without the vision, the passion, and the compassion of John Linton. The world is better for your contributions and a little colder without you. And so we hope that his work and our work continues. It's about breaking cycles of poverty, inequality, and incarceration. And to everyone, we look forward to continuing this dialogue, working in partnership with the higher education and correction sectors to advance our Smart Justice initiative. And we hope that other foundations will also be inspired and see the value in this work and give generously to the criminal justice reform field. We have to seed some of this work before the government is willing to step in and before states are willing to underwrite it. So to the foundation community, we hope to continue to advocate for this work. Please know a recording of this event will be posted on our YouTube channel, the Michelson 20mm Foundation, and sent to everyone who registered. So thank you everyone and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.